When you're trying to either decide on a blanket to knit or perhaps modifying a blanket, you often have to decide on how the blanket goes together. Because of course, you can go with the option of just casting on all the stitches for the blanket size you want and knitting continuously until you've finished it. That does have the advantage that you're not going to have any seaming afterwards, and when you're finished, you're finished. The biggest disadvantage is that it's a really immobile project, because once you hit a certain point with your work, the rows are going to be very long and it's going to be so large that you just can't take it anywhere with you. On the other hand, if you go do it in squares, it makes it a fantastic mobile project. And in fact, with previous clubs, we've had people that will just take a certain number of squares with them on holidays, and so they're lovely bite-sized projects that you can do within the holidays. But all squares are not made equal, of course, because some projects, you may see some blankets out there and they've got very small squares. They're very beautiful, but the downside is when you've got an awful lot of really small squares that you've got an awful lot of seaming. So if you're not a fan of seaming, you're probably going to want to veer towards projects that are going to have slightly larger pieces, because you don't need as many seams together. But those are the two things to think about. Where will you be knitting it? How portable do you want it to be? And how much seaming do you want to do at the end? So when you are reaching the very end of your project, the advantage of having your blanket in squares is that you can block all of those squares individually, which is much easier than blocking one large blanket. What most people find really helpful is, because of the fact that the squares are going to be the same size as a general rule, you can just create an actual template on your blocking mats, or if you've got ones that have grids in it, you can just make sure you're matching up the grids. You wet block them and you pin them out to size, and that means that you don't have to block the finished piece when it's done, and it's much easier to actually seam them all together when you reach the seaming part, because they're all the same size and you're not pulling and manhandling them to try and get them to fit. The next decision, once they're all blocked, is how you put them together. And there is never a right answer to that. And in fact, it was a source of a huge amount of discussion last year with the 2024 Blanket Club as to how you put them together. Because when you're knitting them, there's an obvious bottom and a top for that one, because it was all cables. But Thea, who was the designer with that, she had no strong preference as to whether everybody had them laid out bottom to top, or whether people would orientate some this way and the others vertically. And it came down to personal choice. But the main thing is, before you get started, lay them all out. I'd actually almost suggest taking a photograph, because sometimes it's a little bit easier when you can step back from a photograph to see how you want to put them together. And then once you've actually decided, just pin with just safety pins or stitch markers the ones in the spacing where they go together, so that you don't end up forgetting it. And the photograph really helps with that as well. With our upcoming blanket, you've got an extra little bit of fun going on, because there's 5 different colours, which means that you also get to decide with that as to how you're going to line up each part of the colour, whether they'll all line up together or whether you're going to vary it. What I actually ended up doing when I was running through the project is, when I had just knit the first one, I took a photograph of it and printed it, the number of squares I was going to have, and I lay all of those out. And that allowed me to actually play around with how it was going to be orientated before I ever got started. So it's actually a really fun part of the project, but I would suggest you take your time with it, really think it through before committing to the seaming process.